She was left hanging as a warning, until a lonely cowboy challenged a message. The sun leaned low over the plains, casting a blood-orange hue across the dry horizon, where grass swayed like sea waves and shadows stretched long as broken promises. The only sound was a steady creak of saddle leather and the soft snort of a tired mare. Eli Morgan rode with the loose posture of a man long used to silence, hat low over his brow, eyes always on the distance. His duster flapped gently in the wind, and the rifle at his back never left his shoulder. The land had once been wild with buffalo and songs older than English, but now it wore the dust of railroads and graves. Eli didn't look for trouble anymore. He'd buried his share, walked away from gun smoke and firelight. Now he kept to his cattle and solitude, speaking mostly to his horse in the sky. But trouble had a way of hanging where men could see it. He spotted the tree from a mile out, blackened branches like claws scraping the wind, its silhouette jagged against the amber sky. There were buzzards in the air, circling low and slow, a sure sign something below wasn't done breathing or had only just stopped. Eli didn't quicken his pace, didn't squint or frown. He just guided his horse toward the smell. When he reached the tree, the world narrowed. She hung there like a broken prayer, arms bound to wrists, strung high to a low branch, feet just brushing the dirt. Her head lolled, dark hair matted with dust and blood. Her dress was torn, once white maybe, now red-brown like old rust. Beneath her feet, in crooked letters burned into a wooden plank, a sign read, "White man don't forgive." The wind rocked her gently, as though trying to wake her. A strand of hair lifted across her face. Eli dismounted, boots crunching on dry grass, and approached. No sound came from the girl, no movement save the slow sway. He touched her neck, a faint flutter. Still alive. His knife came free from his belt with a practiced flick. He cut the rope quick and clean, and she dropped into his arms like a sack of feathers, lighter than he expected. She didn't stir. Blood crusted the corner of her mouth. Her left eye was swollen shut. There were bruises shaped like fingers on her throat. She couldn't have been more than 17. Eli looked once at the sign nailed into the bark, then again at the girl in his arms. Apache, by the cut of her features and the blue beadwork, still clinging to her sleeve. He didn't ask why they'd done this. He already knew. A message, a warning, one meant to hang in the wind for as long as the body held. But he was here now. He wrapped her in his coat, lifted her onto his mare with care, and climbed up behind her. The horse shifted, uncertain, but Eli steadied it with a word. The girl sagged against him, breathing shallow, her skin hot with fever. Her wrists were torn raw. Someone had meant for her to suffer, not die fast. They rode slow through the falling dusk, the last light slipping behind distant hills. Eli didn't speak. The girl moaned once, but her head stayed limp. He shifted her weight, mindful of every bump in the trail, every rabbit hole. The mare, sensing the need for gentleness, moved like a whisper. By the time his cabin came into view, a squat, timber frame place tucked beside a crooked stream, the stars were peeking through the deepening blue. The porch light was just a lantern hung from a rusted nail, and the only sound was the creak of old wind chimes and the rustle of chickens settling for the night. He carried her inside and laid her on the guest cot, where his brother once slept before the war made him a name carved into marble. The girl fit there like a ghost, all bone and silence. He lit a lamp, brought water, cleaned her wrists with slow hands. She stirred only once, flinching when the cloth touched her side, but made no sound. He found salve, wrapped her arms, left a bowl of broth near the cot. Then he sat in the old rocking chair across the room and waited, watching her in the lamp's flickering glow. She didn't wake that night. The next morning, he found her sitting up, back braced against the wall, staring at him with one eye swollen, the other sharp and black as coal. Her mouth was set, chin lifted, shoulders square like someone waiting for a fight. He didn't say a word. She looked around, slow, taking the bare wood walls, the rifle by the door, the boots by the hearth. Then she looked back at him and spoke, voice raw as gravel. "Why'd you cut me down?" He answered after a long breath. No one deserved to hang like that. Her eye narrowed. "Maybe I did." "You don't believe that." She didn't respond, only looked at the broth by her side and didn't touch it. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes. A hawk screamed in the distance. Eli stood, poured himself coffee, and didn't offer her any. She noticed. Her eye flicked to his movements. Suspicious, wary, not afraid, though. That part impressed him. After a while, she said, "They'll come for me again." He sipped. "Maybe. They'll come for you, too." He nodded, as if she'd told him the weather. Wouldn't be the first time. That night, she ate half the broth and fell asleep without screaming. He stayed in the chair, eyes open long past the fire-dined embers. The girl breathed shallow, but steadier now. The town found out by morning. A ranch hand from the edge of Eli's land saw smoke from his chimney and rode in to deliver feed. He noticed the girl's dress drying on the line, her boots by the steps. Rode back quicker than he'd come. By noon, word spread from the saloon to the chapel. Eli Morgan took in an Apache girl, the one they strung up, the one who was supposed to stay hanging. No one rode out that day, but the air shifted. Folks muttered. Eyes narrowed. The preacher's wife clutched her Bible harder. The blacksmith spat twice as he passed Eli's empty stall in the livery. Eli didn't go into town. He spent the day repairing fence posts, tending to his cattle, watching the horizon with that same old stillness. Inside, the girl slept, ate, said little. He learned she didn't cry. Not in sleep, not in pain, not even when her fever broke and her skin turned clammy with sweat. 3 days passed. On the 4th, he found her sitting on the porch, wrapped in his old duster, watching the dawn rise over the cottonwoods. She didn't flinch when he joined her. "You got a name?" he asked. She hesitated, then said, "Wea." He nodded. "I'm Eli." She said nothing more. He didn't press. The sun rose slow and gold, spilling light across the valley. Somewhere behind them, the tree still stood, empty now, but not forgotten. Wea looked toward it, then turned her face back to land, jaw tight. She didn't thank him. He didn't ask her to. They sat in silence, not quite strangers anymore, not yet anything else. The world around them held its breath. Somewhere in that hush, a choice had been made. And far down the road, unseen but inevitable, the sound of hooves would one day return. The days unfolded with the slow rhythm of distant thunder, felt more than heard. Wea remained quiet through most of them, though her silence no longer bore the sharp edge of suspicion. She moved carefully, still stiff from bruises and tightly bound muscles, but her feet found steady ground in Eli's cabin. She slept on the cot, ate the bread he made from scratch, drank from the tin cup he placed near the hearth. He didn't hover. He never asked where she'd come from, nor who had tied the noose around her wrists. That, perhaps more than anything, unnerved her. Eli went about his days like a man who'd learned not to expect answers, only endurance. He rose before the sun, lit the stove, tended to his cattle, and worked on mending the back fence. When he came inside, Wea had often returned to the porch, wrapped in the old wool blanket, eyes fixed on the horizon, always watching, always still. Sometimes he found her standing by the tree line behind the house, where the woods grew thicker and the shadows ran longer. She would stare into them as though waiting for something. Memory, vengeance, maybe someone who wasn't coming back. She hadn't smiled once. In the evenings, when the cold pressed in and the wind began whispering under the eaves, she'd sit at the corner of the hearth while Eli read from the only book he kept on the shelf, a tattered volume of Psalms, yellowed and cracked. He read not for worship, but rhythm. The words filled the air like smoke, slow, low, steady. One night, after the fire had burned low and only cinders glowed, she asked, "Why don't you ask me what happened?" Eli looked up from the page. "You'll tell it if you ever want it spoken." Wea stared into the flames, a muscle working in her jaw. Her fingers were tight around the blanket. "They call my brother a thief," she said. "He traded for a horse they claimed was theirs. They tied him to a fence post, beat him. I tried to help." She paused, then continued, slower. "One of them spat on me, said I wasn't a person, just something to hang so the others would remember." Her voice cracked then, but not with tears, like something dry splitting from heat. I kicked him, she added. Bit his hand. So they said I'd swing too. Eli didn't move, didn't blink. The firelight danced over the lines of his face, making him look older than he was. I didn't see my brother again, she finished. After a long silence, Eli said, I'm sorry. She shook her head. Once. You didn't do it. Still, he said it again, softer, I'm sorry. Wea didn't answer, but she stayed beside the fire until she slept sitting up, her head tipped to the side like a tired bird. That was the first night she didn't jolt awake at midnight. The town was less quiet. By the week's end, a wagon rolled up to Eli's gate, paint chipped, drawn by 2 tire horses. The man who stepped down was Sheriff Harlan Graves, tall and dry as winter corn. His badge caught the sun, but his eyes were colder than iron nails. He stood at the fence, hat in hand, and waited for Eli to meet him. Words reached town, the sheriff said. Folks uneasy. Eli leaned on the post, arms crossed. Folks are often uneasy. They ever ask why. The sheriff scratched his temple, sighing. You took in a girl they hung. One they wanted gone. Now she's up and moving around again, and it's stirring the hornet's nest. Eli didn't answer. The wind picked up. Harlan shifted. I'm not here to make you send her away. I know you, Eli. You don't scare easy. But you keep her, and this town might take it personal. She's got a name, Eli said. Harlan nodded once. I imagine she does. Then he climbed back into the wagon and left. Dust rose behind him like smoke from a far-off fire. Wea hadn't stepped outside while he was there. She watched through the cracked window, jaw tight, eyes unreadable. They'll come at night, she said after the wagon vanished from sight. Eli didn't reply. He only walked to the barn and checked the oil in his lanterns, then counted the shells in his rifle with careful fingers. Wea watched him for a long time, then turned and went inside. That evening, she swept the cabin floor. She didn't ask if she could. Eli didn't ask why. They shared the last of the molasses bread and smoked salt pork. She chewed slow, her jaw sore. Eli poured 2 mugs of coffee. Hers went untouched until he wasn't looking. Your wife, she said quietly. She died. He nodded. 3 winters back. Fever took her. You bury her? Up on the ridge, where she could see the whole valley. She liked the way the snow looked from there. Wea lowered her gaze. Must be hard. Carrying grief. It is, he said. But it makes room for something else when you let it rest. She didn't speak again for the rest of the night. But when she rose to go to her cot, she paused. I never said thank you, she murmured. Eli looked at her and shook his head. Don't need it. I know, she said, voice barely audible. But I'm saying anyway. She went to bed without another word. Outside, a coyote howled somewhere distant, lonely and raw. Eli listened to it for a long time before he banked the fire. The next morning brought frost and a thin sun. Wea helped gather eggs. She flinched at the chickens at first, still tender in her limbs, but eventually she laughed when one pecked her hand. Not a real laugh, just a breathy huff, but it pulled Eli's gaze like a flare. He didn't mention it, just handed her the basket and walked back toward the barn. By noon, she was on the porch, soaking her wrist in a tin bowl, face tilted toward the sky. The shadows under her eyes had begun to fade, and color returned to her cheeks, slow as spring thaw. That afternoon, Eli brought in wood, stacked it by the door. Wea watched from the table, folding a cloth that didn't need folding. She said, You think people can come back from what's been done to them? He looked at her. Not all the way, he replied, but enough to build something new. Her lips twitched, almost a smile. You talk like someone who tried. I did, he said, still trying. That night, she didn't sit by the fire. She sat beside Eli on the porch instead, where the wind moved through the grass like ghost dancing. They watched the stars rise one by one, as though summoned by the hush between them. No words passed, just breath and stillness, and the sound of a life quietly beginning again. But even quiet beginnings tremble when danger remembers your name. Far out in the dark, Along the road that curled like a snake through the hills, a single horse cried into the night. Wea didn't turn her head, but her hands tightened around the blanket in her lap. Eli heard it too. He didn't move, just stared into the black horizon, where the stars gave way to shadows. His jaw worked, slow and silent. The porch creaked once beneath them, and still they sat. By the time the first buds pressed through the thawed earth, Wea had taken to walking the land as if relearning how to belong to it. She kept near the stream behind the cabin, never venturing too far into the open, but her steps were firmer, her gaze more alert. Eli noticed she no longer flinched at every distant sound. She started braiding her hair again, a small act, but steady, like stitching herself back together one thread at a time. Eli never asked where she went. He only made sure the rifle stayed loaded, and that his eyes swept the horizon each morning before he touched the saddle. There was something unspoken between them now, not yet trust, but something shaped like it. They spoke more in glances and words, gestures soft and careful. She began to help with chores, feeding the chickens, patching torn blankets, cleaning the soot from a hearth. Eli pretended not to notice at first, as if not acknowledging it would let it stay. Then one morning, she was standing by the fence with his coffee in her hand. She handed it over without speaking. He nodded and sipped. It had just the right amount of bitterness. That afternoon, while repairing the well pump, he caught her singing. A low tune, no words, just breath and tone like wind moving through tall grass. He didn't say a word about it, but that night he stayed awake longer than usual, sitting on the porch, replaying the sound in his mind like a hymn he'd never heard before. When the storm came, it was not in the sky but on horseback. 3 men rode up the hill before the sun had fully risen, dust-caked, broad-shouldered, and not bothering to dismount. Eli stepped out before they could knock, rifle cradled in his arms like a child. The tallest of them, a man with a thick beard and red scarf, leaned forward in the saddle. "We heard you've been harboring what don't belong here." Eli didn't move. "She belongs as much as anyone." The man chuckled. "That so? Might want to ask the folks whose kin didn't come home from Apache arrows." Eli's jaw tightened. "What she's done or hasn't done ain't your business. She was meant to hang. You cut her down. I'd do it again." A pause settled, heavy as storm clouds. The men shifted, spurs jangling, fingers inching closer to holsters. "She's a wound in this town," the bearded man said. "You think keeping her up here in your little hollow's gonna heal anything? You're wrong. You're just dragging it out." Eli didn't blink. "I've buried worse than you." Silence cracked like thunder. The men exchanged glances. Then, without a word, they turned their horses and rode back the way they came, but not fast. Not like cowards. Like men who intended to return. That night, Wea didn't ask what they'd said. She'd seen it in Eli's face when he stepped back inside, jaw clenched, dust still on his boots. She said only, "They won't let it go." "No," Eli answered. "They won't." He cleaned the rifle, checked the shells. Wea stood by the window, arms folded, watching the moon rise. The next morning, she tried to leave. He found her at the edge of the creek, saddlebag in hand, his old canteen slung over her shoulder. She didn't look surprised when he stepped into view. "I can't stay here," she said. "You already are. I'll bring fire down on this place." "You won't bring it. It was already on its way." She shook her head. "You don't understand." "I understand more than you think." She looked away then, shoulders heaving with breath that wasn't quite steady. The wind picked up, cold and biting despite the green creeping back into the earth. "I didn't ask to be saved," she whispered. "I didn't save you." She turned to him, brow furrowed. He met her gaze. "I just didn't leave you to die," he said. "The rest of it, what you do now, that's yours." Silence lingered between them like smoke. Then, slowly, she dropped the bag. That night, she took her meals without looking down. She spoke more than one sentence. Told him her mother's name, her clan's river. He told her his wife's favorite song, how she used to hum while brushing her hair. They didn't smile, not quite, but something loosened. Days stretched longer with the coming spring. Wea began tending a patch of earth behind the house, clearing weeds, breaking the soil with her hands. Eli built a short fence around it, just tall enough to keep the deer out. Neither of them spoke of it as anything more than work, but both knew what it meant. New life in a place that had known only endings. When she asked for boots, he rode to town without hesitation. Eyes followed him the whole way. The storekeeper barely spoke, tossed the box on the counter like it burned. Eli paid in full and left. Back home, he placed them at the foot of her cot. She stared at them a long while before slipping them on. They fit. The next morning, she walked further into the woods than before. Eli watched her vanish into the trees, the new boots leaving deep prints in the mud. She returned with bundles of mint and wild onion, face flushed with exertion but eyes clear. That evening, while the stew cooked, she sat across from him at the table. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was something shared, something full. "I used to think the whole world was one long rope," she said suddenly, "tied around our necks. We were just waiting for someone to pull it." He set a spoon down, waited. "Now I don't know," she continued. "Maybe the rope's still there, but maybe we can cut ourselves." Eli didn't reply. Instead, he reached into the drawer beside the table, pulled out a small knife, handle worn smooth from years of use. He placed it gently on the table between them. "Then cut it," he said. She stared at it, unmoving. Then she nodded once and slid the blade toward her side of the table. Outside, the wind shifted. The hills exhaled. That night, someone fired a shot near the edge of the pasture. Eli rose at once, rifle already in hand. He stepped out into the dark, scanned the field. Nothing moved but the grass. When he returned, Wea was standing barefoot in the kitchen, holding a lantern. Her eyes weren't afraid. "They're testing the ground," she said. "Let them," Eli answered. She didn't go back to bed. Instead, she sat on the floor by the hearth, knees pulled to her chest, and watched the embers fade. Eli sat in his rocking chair, rifle across his lap, and didn't sleep. The war hadn't started yet, but it would. The fire came just after midnight, silent until it wasn't. It began with a flicker near the barn, small, almost delicate, as though it crept in on tiptoe. By the time Eli smelled the smoke, it was already alive, snarling against the dark sky, devouring dry wood and hay in greedy tongues. He threw the door open, barefoot, rifle slung over his shoulder, and Wea was behind him before he spoke a word. They didn't shout, didn't panic. The fear was cold now, not hot, well known and practiced. Eli ran for the pump, while Wea dragged blankets from the line and soaked them in the water barrel. They fought the fire with everything but hope, and by the time the flames were smothered into coughing coals, the barn stood blackened and broken, ribs of its structure still glowing like dying coals in a forge. The horses, by some mercy, had been turned loose earlier. The tools were ash, the feed gone, and in the distance, through the hush that followed the blaze, hooves whispered from the hills. They stood side by side in the sooty grass, breath heavy, skin singed by heat. "They'll come in daylight," Wea said. "They always do." Eli didn't reply. His face was streaked with smoke, jaw clenched like he was biting down on something he refused to swallow. By dawn, he'd rebuilt the fence gate, not because it would stop anything, but because he couldn't stand the sight of it sagging. Wea tended to garden as if nothing had burned, planting new onion bulbs beside the scorched roots. Neither mentioned the barn again. Later that morning, the sheriff rode in alone. His horse was nervous, ears flicking. Harlan Graves dismounted slowly, eyes roaming over the blackened bones of the barn and the soot-streaked cabin. He didn't speak right away. Eli stood on the porch with a rifle in one hand and a mug of cold coffee in the other. "You know who it was?" the sheriff asked. "I've got guesses. You plan to do something about it?" "I'm already doing it." Harlan's eyes drifted to Wea, who stood behind the screen door, still as a deer in tall grass. "You're going to lose more than a barn," he said quietly. Eli didn't blink. "Then let it come." The sheriff sighed. "I don't want a war, Eli. You didn't stop the last one." With nothing else to say, Harlan climbed back on his horse and left. His silence clung heavier than any threat. That evening, Wea stood by the creek. The water moved slowly, brown and swollen from spring melt, carrying twigs and shadows along its back. She watched it flow past, as if it could take her somewhere untouched, somewhere nameless. Eli joined her after a while. She didn't turn. "They'll come tonight," she said. "They think you're bluffing. They'd be wrong. They might kill you." He nodded. "I don't want your blood on my hands." "You never put it there." Weah turned then, slowly, her face unreadable. "You still think this place could be something else?" she asked. "That the land can forget?" "No," he said, "but maybe it can forgive." She looked away, voice low. "That's a luxury. Forgiveness." He didn't argue, just stood beside her until the light faded and the first stars blinked through the treetops. When the riders came, they didn't bother with subtlety. 6 men on horseback, torches held high, rifles slung across their backs. The same red-scarfed man led them, spitting tobacco as he shouted toward the porch. "You've had your chance, Morgan. Time to give her up." Eli stepped out into the yard, unhurried. He wore the same shirt from the morning, sleeves rolled to the elbow, boots still dusted with ash. The rifle rested in the crook of his arm, calm as a preacher's Bible. "She's not yours to take," he said. "She was meant to hang." The man barked. "We carved the message ourselves. You think your kindness gets to erase that. I think you fear what you can't break." The man spat. "That ain't bravery, rancher. That's foolishness." "She survived you," Eli said, voice even. "That makes her stronger than any man here tonight." For a long beat, the night held its breath. Torches hissed. Crickets quieted. Somewhere far off, a coyote howled once and was silent. Then Weah stepped forward. She wore a simple blue dress Eli's wife had once folded into a drawer and forgotten. Her hair was braided, her chin high. She walked past Eli and into the torchlight with neither fear nor hesitation. "Is this what you want?" she asked, voice loud and clear. "To finish what you started? Hang me again so the earth knows your hatred still breathes." One of the men shifted in his saddle. Another coughed. "You couldn't silence me then," she continued. "And you won't now. You don't get to decide if I live." The red-scarfed man sneered. "You think standing out here makes you brave?" "I know it does," she said. The moment stretched thin. Then the sheriff's voice rang out from behind the riders. "That's enough." All heads turned. Harlan rode in slowly, rifle drawn, eyes hard. Behind him were 2 deputies, unsure but present. The riders hesitated. Power shifts quietly sometimes, like a crack in ice. "You want justice?" Harlan said. "Then take it to the law. You want blood? Then I'll see you hang before sunrise." The red-scarfed man's eyes narrowed, but he saw the line that had been drawn. He pulled his reins, spat again, and turned his horse. "Burn with her if you want Morgan," he said. "She's not worth it." "She's worth everything," Eli replied. The riders left one by one. No bullets were fired, just dust and distance. When the silence settled again, it came softer. The sheriff nodded once to Eli, then rode off with his men, leaving behind only the smell of smoke and the tremble of something new. That night, Weah sat beside the fire, a cup of tea cooling in her hands. Eli tended to the embers, not speaking. Finally, she said, "You didn't have to stand with me. I never saw it as a choice." She watched him for a long time, her eyes no longer guarded. "I was meant to be a warning," she whispered. "But maybe I'm beginning instead." Eli met her gaze, the corner of his mouth lifting just slightly. "Then let's begin." The wind pressed gently against the cabin walls, and the river whispered below like an old song, just remembered. If this story stirred something in you, don't forget to subscribe, and hit the bell. More untold tales from the Wild West are coming soon.